In the northeast section of St. John's Cemetery lies the unremarkable grave of a man by the name of Noel Guy Davis. But like most gravestones, they rarely depict the life and accomplishments of those beneath. But this grave honors an aviation pioneer that died trying to advance what the Wright brothers had begun. Every newspaper in the country announced his death and lauded his life. This is his story. He was born on December 23, 1891 in Salt Lake City, the son of Rogar Wood Davis and Lena Bell Leonard. His father was a boat builder and has been referred to as Captain, who ironically states his birthplace as at sea. His father passed away in 1904 and is buried in Salem, Virginia. Bessie, Noel's sister, would marry U.S. Army Captain Irving DeVance Offer, while his brother Harry Garwood Davis was killed in 1912 at the age of 22 years old. At the time of his death, he was trying for a world's motorcycle speed record at the Old Salt Palace when he lost control and was thrown from his cycle, fracturing his skull. Noel would go on to graduate from high school in 1906 before attending and graduating from the Latter-day Saints University. Because of his proficiency in mathematics, it was recommended that he apply for acceptance into the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. He obtained the support of Utah Representative Joseph Howell and was accepted in 1911. He would become the Academy's basketball captain of his class for all 4 years. He was also listed as number 1 in his graduating class of 1914. After graduation, he was assigned as the aide to Admiral William S. Sims and then to Admiral Joseph Strauss. At the outbreak of World War I, he became the chief of staff to Strauss and placed in charge of laying 56,000 mines between Norway and Scotland. This effectively stopped the German submarines from using that pathway to the high seas. After the war ended, he was ordered to remove all the mines that he had so tediously and meticulously put down. The task was dangerous and at one point, one of them blew up, knocking him overboard and nearly killing him. Eventually, his interest in flying led him to volunteering for the flight program at NAS Pensacola in 1920. He was a natural and mastered his studies to the point that he wrote several books on aerodynamics used by later students. He would earn his wings of gold in 1921 and became Naval Aviator No. 2944. But he was not to leave Pensacola without falling victim to the old adage that Pensacola is the mother-in-law of the Navy. Here, he met, courted, and married Pensacolian Mary Elizabeth Kitten Merritt in 1925. She was the daughter of one of the city's most influential businessmen, John Abercrombie Merritt. Kitten held her wedding party at her parents' home at 619 North Baylen Street at the corner of Baylen and Cervantes Street. Noel would leave the Navy in July 1922, but by March 1923, he had been appointed a lieutenant in the Naval Reserves. By June 1924, he had taken command of the Naval Reserve Aviation Unit in Squantum, Massachusetts. The base had a history in aviation and in fact, in 1912, Harriet Quimby, the first woman pilot in the United States, was killed there in her aircraft. In 1927, the Denison Airport opened for business at the lower end of the Squantum Peninsula. There, Amelia Earhart became an employee and pilot. The Squantum Naval Air Station began its operations in the 1920s as a Naval Reserve training base where Noel and Kitten would make their home. While at Squantum, Noel became interested in the Orteig Prize that had originally been offered in 1919. The prize of $25,000 was promoted by New York City hotel owner Raymond Orteig to be awarded to the first Allied aviator, or aviators, to fly nonstop from New York City to Paris, or vice versa. But, from 1919 to 1925, no one tried because the feat was thought to be impossible. However, on June 1, 1925 Ortiz offered the prize again, since the technology of flight had improved to the point that it was now considered feasible. Of course, such a large reward was always tempting, worth $440,000 today, but there was also tremendous glory that would be earned for such a Herculean accomplishment. This feat was carefully planned by Commander Davis, and he repeated the mantra of, "This is not a stunt, but a scientific effort." Once his mind was made up, he had to decide what kind of plane he was going to need to make such a flight. So, Noel petitioned the Navy for the release of one of their bombers, and they had agreed. He had selected the Pathfinder aircraft, built by the Keystone Company out of Bristol, Pennsylvania. He also began studying the art of navigation, a skill that would become very important in the near future. The Pathfinder was developed by Keystone as a civil transport based on the bomber version they were producing for the Army Air Corps. It had a biplane design with two lower wing engines mounted and a third engine mounted on the nose. There was a passenger cabin added to the fuselage that was modified for the Atlantic flight. With the aircraft selected, he now needed a co-pilot as a backup just in case something happened. He selected 32-year-old Navy Lieutenant Stanton Hall Wooster from Connecticut. A student at Yale in the class of 1915, he left to attend the U.S. Naval Academy class of 1917, and was considered an experienced pilot by his command. With the aircraft and co-pilot selected, Davis and Wooster immediately began working on their flight plan, as well as preparing the aircraft for the arduous flight. But first they had to christen the plane before they did anything else. On April 20, 1927, the plane was christened by Noel's wife Kitten, who named it the American Legion. In the meantime, Wooster was courting Miss Sally Finney from Washington, D.C., which was followed by a proposal of marriage. So, after the christening, they decided to fly the plane to Mitchell Field on Long Island, where Army and Navy mechanics completed a lengthy inspection and deemed the aircraft in great shape. Kitten and Sally had flown with the two men on their return flight to Langley Field, Virginia. In fact, Noel's wife Kitten liked to fly and had decided to make the transatlantic flight with her husband as a radio operator. However, at the last moment she backed out because of their young son. But the greatest concern to Davis was the takeoff weight of the aircraft. They had tested it at 15,000 pounds, and it had performed perfectly. But on April 26, 1927, it was time for the two men to make their final test flight, but with their aircraft fully loaded this time. The weight for the final test flight was a total of 16,480 pounds that included 9,000 pounds of fuel, 800 pounds of oil, plus crew and equipment. As they went through their final preparations, they couldn't help but think about those contestants that had already had their own difficulties. One was Richard Evelyn Byrd, the first man to fly over the North Pole in 1926. During one of their practice takeoffs, he and his crew crashed, severely injuring Floyd Bennett and slightly injuring Byrd. The second team took off from Roosevelt Field on April 12, 1927, and was comprised of Clarence Chamberlain and fellow aviator Bert Acosta. They flew back and forth over Long Island until they broke the longevity record of 4,100 miles. Ironically, they flew 500 miles further than they would have needed for the New York to Paris flight. In an interview, Chamberlain stated that they had broken a record, but just not the transatlantic one. Another team was made up of the World War I French ace Charles Nungesser and 3 crewmen, who took off from Le Bourget Airport near Paris on May 8, 1927, and headed for New York. Their plane was painted with his old World War I insignia. Sadly, their plane was last sighted heading over Ireland, but they never arrived, and it's assumed they crashed somewhere in the North Atlantic. Another World War I ace, René Fonck, crashed on takeoff on September 21, 1926, when his landing gear collapsed, killing 2 of his 3 crewmen. Now it was Davis and Wooster's turn for their final practice takeoff. Based on these prior failures, the drama began to build across the nation as the Davis and Wooster team were completing their preparations. Of course, with 4 teams still in the running, each vied with the other to be the first to take off. Noel was even experimenting with wood versus metal propellers to ascertain the best for speed and fuel consumption, both critical factors during the historic flight. Every day brought new headlines as the publicity and tension rose. Suddenly, a new story surfaced that Noel was contemplating taking off for his historical flight from Pensacola rather than New York. Of course, this would have been totally against the rules set forth by Raymond Ortigue and his committee had it been true. However, Noel told the press that he had no intention of leaving from Pensacola, since he was well aware that it would violate the Ortigue rules. As the time grew near, the atmosphere became more tense, as the media couldn't get enough of the contestants. Even their planes were guarded and fawned over like famous race horses at the starting gate. As the tests neared their end, Noel became concerned with the plane's ability to take off so heavily laden. However, Noel stated, "All the tests made with the plane have been perfect. I have never piloted a better plane. I have been particularly pleased with the manner in which the plane gets up when loaded. Some of us have feared that when loaded to capacity, as she will be when we start on our long flight, a large field would be necessary for her to get up. The contrary has been proven." However, even with Noel's stated confidence in the aircraft, there was still that shred of doubt remaining. But the only way to eliminate it was to conduct a fully loaded test on takeoff, which was planned for the morning of April 27, 1927. Wanting to be part of her husband's endeavor, Kitten took over the trip's food preparation. To ensure that they had enough, she personally saw to the stocking of the larder. There would be 48 sandwiches of roast beef, chicken, and ham, and a large container of hard-boiled eggs. Added to the cache would be coffee and water in thermos bottles. Emergency rations would consist of 36 2-ounce packages of sliced beef plus hardtack, chocolate bars, and a dozen packages of chewing gum. The weather that morning was satisfactory, and the plane was fueled and ready to go, therefore Noel made the decision to take off at 6:30 in the morning. Sally had left for Washington, D.C. the night before, expecting to return when they left for Europe. She and Wooster were to be married just before his final takeoff. As for Kitten, she was visiting friends, with her accompanying brother Richard Hill Merritt and sister Mrs. Doris Rule. Noel's mother was very worried about her son, especially having lost one son already in 1912. He assuaged her fears that the plane was a great plane. She told him she was going to leave her home in Oakley, Idaho, and travel down to Salt Lake City so that she could be closer to receive any news of his flight. He told her that was unnecessary, because he had arranged with the Associated News to send her a message every hour as to their progress. With all the planning now over, it was time for takeoff. Early on the morning of April 26, Davis revved his engines after warming them up and taxied out to the runway. He then applied his brakes and throttled the engines to full power before releasing them and rumbling down the runway. The American Legion lifted off without difficulty and straightened out for her cross-country test flight. Then, something went wrong. Bystanders felt there may have been engine failure, but for whatever reason the huge aircraft began coming down. Davis made what would have been a good landing, however the ground below was a very marshy area, and after traveling about 125 feet the wheels bogged down and the plane flipped over in the mud and water, burying its nose in the muck. This in turn trapped both pilots inside the wrecked cockpit, and it was first thought drowning them. Suppositions sprang up immediately as to what actually killed the two men. A naval board convened and stated they felt both men were killed instantly from the impact. If not, they would have died from the gas fumes pouring into the cockpit. This theory was supported by the fact that Davis' face was crushed and Wooster's neck was broken. Both pilots were removed from the wreckage and transported to the Portsmouth Naval Hospital. After reviewing the medical reports and the eyewitness statements, it was the Naval Board's final opinion it was the impact that killed the two heroes. Davis' wife Kitten was notified of his death shortly afterwards. His mother would receive a phone call from the Associated News of the same. Pensacola now prepared for the burial of their hero in St. John's Cemetery. Less than a month after Davis was buried in Pensacola, Charles Lindbergh made his successful crossing of the Atlantic in the spirit of St. Louis on May 21, 1927. Noel's mother, Lena Bell Leonard Price, was living at 619 North Bayland Street as late as 1931, but would pass away in a Salt Lake City hospital on May 7, 1939, after undergoing major surgery. Kitten's sister Doris Merritt would marry Lieutenant Adrian Ogle Rule Jr., U.S. Naval Aviator No. 3069 in 1926. Adrian had graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in the class of 1919, although due to World War I they graduated them in 1918. During World War II, Adrian became the commanding officer of the aircraft carrier USS Bonhomme Richard. In 1948, Captain Rule would suffer a fatal heart attack while vacationing with his family in Jacksonville, Florida. Doris would pass away in 1983 and was buried in St. John's Cemetery.